I've called this lecture Making It Up as I Go Along, or if you want something more formal, Finding the Cornerstones of Creativity. I doubt I could ever find adequate words to give thanks for this award. When Libby Limbrick phoned and asked if I'd accept it, I was absolutely dumbstruck. I'm deeply honoured to be part of the stunning lineup of previous recipients, which starts, of course, with Margaret Mahy herself, a light brighter and steadier than anyone else could ever aspire to be. Yet, why should we not aspire to any goal, whether we reach it or not? That's part of what being creative is about, seeing how much you can achieve. But in my first stunned hours after the phone call, I was walking around like, for days actually, I wondered, how did this happen? What brought me to this pinnacle on which I still feel giddy and teetering? And that's partly why I'm sitting down today. That led me to wonder what it is that makes a writer or forms any creative person. What are the key factors? That's what I want to explore today, how I became a writer and why I became the sort of writer I am. Of necessity, this will be all about me, but I hope it will make people think about what drives them and, more important, what gives their drive its specific direction. Early on, I sometimes felt I had no right to write because I lived such an ordinary life. In some ways, I thought I'd have had more right had I been, for instance, and don't be shocked, Jewish or Roman Catholic. Those writers have such a deep background to excavate for material. But then, writing my second novel for adults, Gingerbread Husbands, I found myself mining my own Anglican upbringing and had an oasis in the wilderness moment. Even a very ordinary life has hidden treasure. By now, in my writing for any audience, child or adult, I see signs of the same seams of awe, subversion and humour in the treatment of the material, and obstinacy that keeps me going. I've always written for adults and children, but these days some people try to explain my switch to writing for children by asking me, I suppose it's easier because it's shorter? Well, no. For one thing, the children's novels are not much shorter, and a short story for grown-ups is, well, short. Picture books are so very short, poetic and coded that I find them far too difficult. And that question implies that little stories are not completely worthy. I've never understood that dismissive attitude about any kind of story. It's the belittling way many regard genre fiction, and the grouping of novels by women under the banner of domestic fiction, as if domestic is something to be ashamed of. Though when men write it, it's literary. More on feminism later. The difference for me between writing for children and adults is in the degree of playfulness in the treatment, but there is subversion in both, and keep that in mind as I rattle on. Rattling and clattering, the discordant tries of the apprentice. In Dunedin at the moment, as children's writer in residence, each morning I pass a daycare centre. I can't help smiling at the industry and earnest play of those small humans. One day I heard determined random notes and a tuneless song, a little girl bashing a xylophone, chanting "ah" on a monotone. She was utterly absorbed, copying what she'd heard grown-ups do, thoroughly enjoying herself. Who knows, one day she might play percussion at the Met. She might become a panel beater, or compose overtures to rival the 1812. Or to my mind, any author, musician, composer, painter, sculptor, anyone engaged in a creative pursuit at any level of a career is likely to begin a new piece by the equivalent of tuneless bashing. It is play of a kind. So what happens from there? To what extent does the life inform the work? And how does the process of writing, for instance, begin to inform the author about his or her own life? It is worth thinking about the mine of your own creativity. I've come to see it in a way that I hope others might find comforting. This idea was given me by Vivian Lynn, a New Zealand artist in mixed media. I met her at a writing course given by Chris Else and myself. Years later, I met her again and said the notion had resonated with me. She had no memory of it at all, but she was very pleased and thought it was probably true. The idea is based on 3 key features, some cornerstones, if you like. First is the background you're born with, your family, their situation, rich, poor, indifferent, urban, rural, your gender, your place in the family, first child, middle child, and so on. The second is your experience as you grow up, how you're treated, how you respond, accidents, good or bad, schooling, and so on. These first two basic groups of things you can't change. But as we grow, we make small incremental personal decisions and observations. So the third feature is your angle on all that has happened to you or that you see in the world around you. For authors, that tends to come out in what we write, whether we know it or not while we're setting words down. My own background was not dramatic or traumatic, except in moving to different towns and cities rather often. I am a middle child. My brother and sister, twins 8 years my senior, thought I was cute till I was old enough to annoy them. That might be why I went through a stage of tantrums, which I still remember, and why after that I learned to get my own way in stubborn silence. I was little, I didn't know as much as they did, and I didn't like being laughed at or patronised. I should add, we often played very nicely despite the age difference, and I loved them, but by the time I was about 6, I'd become more of an observer and very shy. One of my most loved books when I was about 4 was The 5 Chinese Brothers by Claire Houchet Bishop. It is now probably thought politically incorrect, but what did it mean to me as a child? I was the young one, the small one, then a new baby sister arrived and I was an in-between. In The 5 Chinese Brothers, each family member is crucial to the unfolding of the tale. Each brother has a particular skill that helps save the life of the one falsely accused of drowning a very naughty boy. I think this reassured me on a deep level that everyone has a special place. It was also very subversive. The family gleefully trick the authorities at every turn. What child wouldn't love that? If it's non-PC, so what? It has a moral centre that reassures the child audience. Very early, I was collecting and arranging books of all sorts on a shelf in my own room. I'm still full of resentment at my otherwise wonderful mother for giving most of my childhood collection to one of my nieces when I was away at university. I still want my copy of Mr. Galliano's Circus, of Into the Happy Glade. It wasn't just the experience of the particular story, it included the look and feel of that particular copy with my name in the front and all the changes of address. Last year on my shelves, I rediscovered my copy of Our Street by Brian Sutton Smith and noted my Kelburn address in my 8-year-old printing, the Mount Eden address in my 10-year-old hand, and in my 16-year-old italics, the Oamaru address. How fantastic it is that my parents in the late 1950s were happy for me to read and own Our Street, a book that many straight-laced critics and teachers of the time considered shocking. Did that book have impact on me because it was written by my school teacher in Standard 2? Or because as a writer and finally internationally respected educator, Sutton Smith understood children and their ordinary Kiwi lives so very well? He most certainly understood the significance of the small moments in a child's life. My mother had been a teacher, by the way, the first woman at Otago to graduate with a BA and teaching certificate in the same year. She never pushed us, simply put within our reach things that might interest and encourage us. I found her collection of Greek drama so interesting as a teenager that I preferred it to bothering with boyfriends. Whether that was good or bad, who knows? She was neither prescriptive nor proscriptive. She also bought Superman and Batman comics and my favourite, The Phantom. So she provided a smorgasbord of reading and of theatre. When I was about 12, she took me to 3 performances in Auckland by the Old Vic Company starring Vivian Leigh. I still remember the 12th night in Alexandra Dumas' Lady of the Camellias. Well, perhaps Mum found it easier to give any sex education through literature rather than be direct, but I learned eventually. Another part of my background was the feminism of the 1970s. I'd had my own waves of angry surprise during the 60s, but in university days felt voiceless. For instance, there were several women medical students, maybe 12, maybe 10 or 12. The male med students used to call them a bunch of draks. I'm still not entirely sure what that meant. Was it that they sucked the blood out of the male-dominated medical profession? It included not beautiful. To my mind, many of them were. But why were their looks relevant? The men's looks didn't seem to be. Those women were intelligent and dedicated. What was wrong with that? I had done a double BA intending to go on in history, but the history courses available focused on facts rather than what I was most interested in, human beings, the little people, the fabric of society in different eras. What did the Russian Revolution mean to the peasant? What did the Great Fire of London mean to an urchin? I didn't respond to dry facts. I preferred the detail that illustrates the general. I wanted history made human. So for my MA, I went on in English literature and literary criticism. That year I married, and my first baby was born the following January. While I was busy with her, I felt the feminist movement itself sort of swing past overhead. I tutored at Otago for a year or two. Then the very month my med-student husband and I were leaving Dunedin to live in Christchurch, I saw a university creche had opened. I felt a lift in the heart that such things were available now. I felt a plummet that it was a little too late for me to take advantage of it myself. Daycare, it's for the little humans and their parents who want to or need to work. The little people, big and small. My first husband and I did discuss feminism. We agreed that society depended on men and women doing equal work, though it might well, and often had to be, different work to keep the family going. Domestic or dollar-earning work, both should be respected. Somehow, over time, though I was working outside the house much of the time, I experienced the female being regarded as secondary. Hang on, how had that happened? By then, I'd started to write short stories for adults, and at this stage, the writing started to bring in female protagonists. However, even the male protagonists of my first stories were marginalised in some way, or at least observed other people being marginalised. My stories are still usually about misfits. Everyone who isn't a narcissist probably thinks they're at least a bit odd, and many of us hope no one else notices, though some extroverts might long for any attention. Though I wasn't a misfit as such in my own family, I was the only introvert, which was, okay, a misfit. My problem child, my mother called me with some affection, even when I was 42. By then, she had some cause. I think it's probably important that I knew no other New Zealand writers till well into the 80s. I'd been published here, but had worked on my own. It's up to someone else to say if that was an advantage or otherwise. And it was by accident that I had begun to write at all. Because of my university studies, I'd always thought writing would be far too complex and difficult for me. But I went to a night class in creative writing thinking it would be little lectures about the principles of a short story and so on. Oh no, you had to do the writing yourself. So my first attempts at writing were simply to see if I could. I wasn't driven in terms of being published or of thinking I had something to say about anything. I remember asking Fiona Kidman once if it was arrogant to think anyone else would want to read what you wrote. In hindsight, it might not have been particularly wise to ask this of an eminent New Zealand author. But I was asking, how do I dare? She replied with a stern frown, I had stories to tell and I must do it. So I stopped fretting about that at least. She said I had stories to tell. And I was certainly driven to explore the challenge of making something, finding my own way to do it. But once you've begun a creative career, what keeps it going? Some aspects of your makeup come more and more into play. I had some success with short stories, but there were failures. And sometimes that was a blessing. If the first novel I wrote had ever been published, I'd have been too ashamed by now to poke my nose out of hiding. There were touches of subversive humour in it, but I was a long way from realising that would be the sort of thing I could build on. I learned a lot from trying to make something as long and complicated as a novel. I learned a lot by throwing the attempt in the bin. At that stage, I sensed where I'd gone wrong. It was like a badly packed suitcase. But I had no idea how to unpack and do it again. Then good feedback keeps you going. A man at a reading of my first one-act play toppled backwards with laughter. I could be funny. I immediately wanted to write something else that would have a similar effect. The comment from a critic of that same play that it was comic existentialism. I'd written that. I hadn't even known existentialism could be funny. After I'd had short stories for both audiences published, radio plays, other bits and pieces, but still no novel, I applied for a Creative New Zealand grant and didn't get it. I was discouraged, which is normal, but I knew slightly someone who did get a grant, and I thought, well, I'm just not good enough yet. I knew I needed to be more aware of technique. One way I hoped to improve was by doing the Victoria University Creative Writing paper, the Bill Manhire course. This was in the days before the IIML. There wasn't much in it directly about technique, but the undoubted help it gave was unexpected gold to value my own judgment. We had to articulate our response to the writing of other students. What a wealth I learned from that and could carry into my own work. It also helped almost at once with doing assessments, manuscript assessments with Chris Else in the first days of our business, TFS. I see it this way. At last I had somewhere to combine that early training at Otago and my own writing experience. I've learned something more with every assessment I've done since then, 1988. I've learned to recognise and communicate what succeeds, why something feels awkward or flat. There is no excitement quite like seeing a flash of genius in something raw and hoping you can find a way to bring that writer up where they belong. In the maybe 1,500 manuscripts I've seen over the years, there have been some common errors or problems. I've also sadly seen them in some published work. One is message pushing or soapboxing. Here, writers are not making it up as they go along. Instead, the author is so determined to give a message that it causes plot holes and unbelievable characters. Another bugbear is the undigested information that can clog, for example, historical novels, or background detail as impenetrable as a barricade. The reader can't be bothered struggling over it and goes off to scrub the bathroom. A third annoyance is poetic writing, which might be very beautiful, but is about nothing. It's like eating air rather than sinking your reading teeth into a narrative with convincing character and credible incident that illustrates an aspect of human nature. Then there's the writer who's not interested in the necessary marriage of craft and truth in the narrative. Readers of fiction like characters who are flawed, as we all are. We're all nice people in somebody's view, but in other views we're probably monsters. Remember, the monster is hero of his or her own domestic tale. The most important thing I've learned from my own struggles and from assessing manuscripts is story structure. Structure is character. Character development is the arc of the narrative. That movement in a story keeps a reader involved. I believe every reader unconsciously expects that sort of pace, movement, and development. I come to my first published novel, The Warrior Queen, the story of a faithful wife who finds her husband is not faithful and how she gets subversive revenge. The first draft spilled out 2,000 words a day. The next drafts were slog. Inspiration, slog again. Those were the days when the New Zealand bestseller list combined fiction and non-fiction. My own particular brand of humour, subversion and absurdism, kept the novel on the list for about a year, and there were overseas editions. Unexpected. Nice. But it was actually the fourth novel I'd written. First published, that's all. I'd learned to pick myself up, to persevere, often with the help of family and friends. I know disappointment. I had hunched weeping by the shadowy privacy of the compost bin because of rejections, some that strangled the spirit. I'll quote one in full. Barbara can do better. That was for an early version of The Warrior Queen. The thing is, that publisher was right. I gritted my teeth. I firmed my jaw. I buckled on the buskins of obstinacy and wielded the keyboard of bugger him. I sent the result to another publisher. After 2 weeks, a fax came saying, "We want it." And I thought, but I haven't suffered enough yet. Could I? I wrote 4 more contemporary novels about the apparently insignificant person, the tiny incident or put-down that can change lives. The thing is, often a little person often has humour, only has humour as a weapon, as a defence. That subversive humour often led to the label feminist writer. Well, not really. I think the humour is more from my general attitude to any authority. I wasn't writing on behalf of women, that would be message-driven. I observed male-female relationships and showed the ironies and absurdities, thereby giving some male critics uneasy moments. Well, if the truth hurts. During that time, my first 2 children's novels came out, and there was the Vic Fellowship. Bill Manhire was on sabbatical that year, and that was a pity. He'd have helped when on my first day, a senior staff member glanced up offhand by the photocopier and said, "Oh, Barbara, don't be offended if nobody speaks to you. We're all very busy people, you know." I kept my head down for at least 3 months, creeping in and out like a mouse shadow. During that year, I also edited a small anthology for Random House, Grandstands, New Zealand Writers on Being Grandparents. That was fun and led unexpectedly to something bigger. Random had published 30 New Zealand stories for New Zealand children and needed a new editor for the second edition, another 30 stories. Harriet Allen, the editor I'd worked with on Grandstands, suggested my name to the children's editor, Jenny Helen. She thought I'd been efficient and that my background as literary agent and assessor would be an advantage, plenty of contacts. I hesitated. I really hesitated. But the notion was intriguing. With encouragement from Chris, who believes more of me than I do, I said yes. I remembered the way stories pleased and satisfied me as a child and the responses of my own children when I read to them. But this was a much harder task than the grandparents' collection. I really had to figure it out as I went along. How best to call for submissions, how to choose the 30 stories necessary, how to word the rejection letters, those awful papers of doom that darken the soul. Then how to place the selected stories in the best order to keep a child picking through and turning pages. I balanced happy with sad, short with long, male protagonists with female heroes, and in one collection struggled against the preference of the illustrator and managed to keep all the dead grandparent stories well separated. Working on that first collection, I noticed many local authors writing science fiction and fantasy, areas that New Zealand publishers traditionally were loath to support. There'd be enough to make a separate anthology, I told Jenny Helen. A few months later, I asked her if they were going ahead, and if so, who would be editor. She said Random did want to do it, with me again. I was a bit taken aback, but I figured I'd learned something from doing that first one. It led to another 6 anthologies for children and one for teenagers, like Wallpaper. 2 of the anthologies scored notable books listings. Something must have gone right. Being quiet and stubborn definitely helped with the anthologies. I knew Random could well have objections to some pieces, so each time I made sure I accepted all the 30 stories before I showed any of the set to the publisher. I was prepared for big arguments. There were a couple, but only genteel ones. With each new anthology, I felt more confident and could streamline the process. The bashing away gradually became more efficient, more tuneful, except for my scream the day I found a weta clinging like a bulldog clip to the chosen stories for Weird and Wonderful. I'm proud of the anthologies. In each, I think there's at least one previously unpublished writer. It was so satisfying that many of them went on to publish more, some very widely, picture books, non-fiction, novels for children or young adults. Some of them have become award-winning, stars in our literary sky. The making it up of any book continues with the publishing process. That went beautifully with the anthologies. Those good-looking books are still pounced on in school libraries, preferred wet day lunchtime reading for many children. The hardcovers have had plenty of use and even battered still look appealing, saying to children, here's something that's been loved, you try it. I'm deeply grateful to Harriet Allen for her part in it all. I'm very aware that those anthologies published between 2002 and 2011 played a very significant part in bringing me here today. The MNZM in 2005 should maybe be mentioned for services to literature. I wasn't sure I'd earned it, but by then I'd had grants, for which I heartily thank Creative New Zealand, had been a judge of the Children's Book Awards, among other things. If I turned it down, would it be offered to another writer that year? No. And the Governor-General, Dame Sylvia Cartwright, had read The Warrior Queen. As she pinned the medal on me, she told me she'd loved it, but she'd been overseas and, at an exciting part, as she put it, had come upon a series of totally blank pages. Misprint in the hands of Dame Sylvia. Ouch. In 2007 came the publication of my historical novel, Wild Latitudes. Writing that playful take on the 1860s had been a massive challenge, full of pleasure. It had my best reviews ever. I started a new historical novel, but the effort of research in tandem with writing, as well as keeping the assessment service going, was horrendous. I applied for another grant, didn't get it, and thought, fair enough. I don't like bleating, and nobody has a built-in right to any grant. But I couldn't move on to anything new. I was exhausted. I felt all mined out. I had lost the joy of writing. And that felt pretty terrible. But then the idea for a new children's novel rose up. A chance remark from me about the fun of tricking cranky toddlers into eating, and how there could be a novel about a specialty restaurant for that. My first grandson, months later, asking if I'd written that book yet. Wow. Working on the travelling restaurant rekindled the joy of writing many times over. I thought it might never be published. It was a novel in a crammed field. I often assessed other manuscripts in this area and saw how hard it was to be original. Was I bringing anything new to the genre? Or if not new, was there some angle that came out of my background or experience or personality? I decided it was the humour. It's a subversive humour, the child's view of the mess adults have made of the world. I've talked about history being made up of the tales of the insignificant person who illustrates what is happening in the wider political background. The tales of Fontaigne are turned into a quartet of novels about little people, different child protagonists each time, with an overall political story in the background. The travelling restaurant begins with an autocratic monarchy. The Queen and the nobody boy moves to benign monarchy. In the fourth book, The Not Impossible, comes the first attempt at democratic government in the Council of Wisdom, acronym COW. There is a constant rebalancing between nature or spirituality and magic and science. I chose Gecko Press when we came to try for a publisher for the travelling restaurant because of their reputation for beautiful books, insistence on quality from paper to design to cover artist. I hoped Gecko would choose me in return. When they did, I danced around as lightly as a 12-year-old. Thank goodness for the privacy of your own home. The process of working on the travelling restaurant drew me back into the crucial state I'd lost touch with for a while, the state any artist needs. An almost meditative state and where the angle from which they apprehend the real world is fully focused on the task. It's that I credit for its success and for somehow bringing me here today. While writing that book, there were moments when the words flowed easily and the editor in the end hardly touched a sentence. Such moments are rare, precious, but somewhat bewildering. Writers in all genres, fiction and non-fiction, know them. You read it again and think, where did it come from? I saw a TED talk by Elizabeth Gilbert when she talked about moments, these moments that feel like gifts, and how the word genius comes from the Greek for wall, meaning the spirit that dwells there and sometimes breathes on your shoulder. For me, I think the author reaches that liminal mode of being between self-criticism and self-belief. You move back and forth along that boundary, immersed in the narrative of your own creation. All the experience of craft and all you know about your story, character, essay, or whatever you're working on comes together. It's a combination of the hard work you've already done and instinct. Those moments show me what I have to do to make the work overall consistent. That includes finding for each page the detail that gives something for the reader to react to on a level of realism and identification, even though the children's stories may be fantasy. The domestic, the small thing, is crucial. But most days I chant the tuneless then wrestle through days, weeks, months of crafting and recrafting. There's a different relish to be had, finding out how to shape the narrative in the best way, experimenting to find the right tone and voice for that particular tale. George Saunders, who writes children's books and essays for places like The New Yorker, has said, your own discontent with the story urges you to higher ground. Knowing there's something to reach for, to aspire to, is a crucial drive for the stubborn author. When to keep going and when to let go. There are still wrong turnings for me, but I don't say that as discouragement. For instance, in the Children's Fellowship at the moment, I'm working on a new novel. The initial idea was kindled by the old English story of Beowulf with the monster son and more monstrous mother. I'd done 3/4 of a rough draft and prepared to leap into the finale. I thought, right, now remind yourself what the main character has at stake. My very next thought was, oh, not as much as another character. Then, I have the wrong protagonist. The best way into the fortress of this particular novel was not the first door I'd found. The story's the same, it just must be told a different way with a different voice. 36,000 words down the drain? No. I was ruefully amused and delighted with the new angle. The thing is to make the novel as well as I can. In each first draft, to some extent, I am the reader, finding out as I go along. Readers usually have an idea of where a story will go, but exactly how something will happen is a mystery. They expect surprises. I feel, why would I bother writing at all if I know exactly how it ends? So the making it up as you go along isn't a glorious swoop to the final line. It's a journey that holds some enchantment, wrong turnings included. It takes those sisters of stubbornness, discipline, and perseverance. Being stubborn includes preserving your writing time. Can you take the risks with family and friends of saying, go away, I can't meet you, I'm busy? How to find a balance between respecting your own work, even when it's at the sow's ear stage, and honouring your family. My own daughters, Emma and Sarah, were and still are patient, and I admire their own creativity and abilities. Chris is unendingly encouraging. I learn a lot from seeing his own creativity at work and his dedication. But yes, artists do need the 10,000 hours at least if they're to build and sustain a career. Raw talent can take you so far and often create something more exciting than a highly polished piece, but craft helps with the continuing journey. And making it up involves saying no, giving yourself time to make it up. Here's a quote from Kevin Ashton in How to Fly a Horse, The Secret History of Creation, Invention and Discovery. Saying no has more creative power than ideas, insight and talent combined. No guards time, the thread from which we weave our creations. The math of time is simple. You have less than you think and need more than you know. Sorry, but he's right. A close relative of being stubborn is being thick-skinned about those demeaning asides. The domestic fiction label, even the, a children's writer, if it's said with a certain twitch of the nose. Support from family and friends helps with that. So does your own sense of humour. The wife of a prominent public servant commented, "Oh yes, the warrior queen, there wasn't much philosophy in it." Isn't a novel built from feeling and image? Should it not leave readers to figure out their own philosophy? I thought that was her failing, not mine. But let's have a moment about the imposter syndrome. As I mentioned earlier, why do I dare write anything? How do I dare, for example, accept this award? Well, the self-critic is good for your work, but enemy or the imposter syndrome is not. When it tries to slide its dripping snout over the threshold, heave the door shut, have a whine while it whines out in the cold. But I do know that beast can be hard to dislodge. Something to remember is any creative person makes it up on the body of work already done by others. Knowing what has been written gives permission to authors coming along, lets them begin working with their own special angle and unique eye. As far as my own contemporary adult novels go, in New Zealand there is of course Fiona Kidman, first to ride the feminist wagon, rather a Wild West image, and she looked great on a horse. There are Marilyn Duckworth, Shona Kauia, Fiona Farrell, Linda Burgess, just a few names, but each one tackling contemporary New Zealand life in her own way with her own angle. I'm not sure how the next thing I want to say fits here, but I feel it does. I believe writing for children carries an added responsibility. More so than works for an adult audience, it requires awareness of its effect on the reader. A children's author needs first to entertain, but also to stay aware of the moral or ethical elements in the narrative and handle them carefully. But you all know this. I'm not saying be prudish or push a worthy message, as I've mentioned before. There's a story I heard about a foster child who was having great trouble learning to read. One day, she looked up astonished at her foster mother and said, "When I read, I'm getting pictures in my head. Does that happen to you?" That is what it's about, hoping to open up possibilities in a young reader's imagination. If you feel you do that, it is a deeper joy than praise from adult readers, although both are very nice, I won't kid you. A recent joy for me was learning that at the end of this year, Kate de Goldie, Susan Pearson Gecko Press, are bringing out a children's annual. Kate described it to me as building on the achievement of the Random House anthologies. I felt deeply satisfied. I hope it will be something that does continue each year and offers space for new and established authors and illustrators. I believe it will excite young readers and, most important, encourage more of that age group to love books. Without readers, in the end, we have no publishing. And it's very hard in the market at the moment. It has been for some years, and it's not improving fast, though there are one or two good signs. The big local publishers may be limiting what they do for children's writing, but smaller presses are finding their feet. Duck Creek is now well established. I didn't know you'd be here today, David, but... and there is Makaro Press, and there are others. In the current market, I wonder if there's room for some sort of self-publishing collective to bring local children's stories to their deserved audience. But there would need to be stringent quality controls. I've heard booksellers say that in the past, the poor quality of some self-publishing and vanity arrangements have damaged reader appetite for New Zealand writing. But I'm chuffed as the only word to see such good quality self-published books on this year's notable books list. They're a special triumph for the authors to write such excellent work and also understand the utmost importance of professional editing, design and production. Respect to them. As I said, there are hopeful signs. I have seen and appreciate the collegiality at work amongst writers for children. I believe it comes from their understanding of and respect for their audience. I wish everyone could see how important it is to encourage variety in our local literature. I hope I see glimmers that a classism among adult authors might be weakening. After this, what next for me? Well, there are some things I can never learn to do and I won't try. Picture books, poetry. What I most admire and can never hope to emulate in narrative fiction is effortless minimalism, where one slender sentence carries a weight of meaning. Our own Fleur Beale is a master mistress of this, especially in her Esther trilogy. I'd love to edit another teenage anthology. Teenagers are more edgy and sophisticated these days, and it would be delicious to get to grips with work that celebrated that. I'd like to write at least another 3 children's books, but maybe 3 adult novels, including that other historical one, are getting agitated in the waiting room. But this is the moment. Here I am. I give thanks to Margaret Mahy herself for her example, for the name I'm now associated with. Someone congratulated me by saying I had fitting shoulders for her mantle. Well, no, but I thank the unique Margaret for what she did for New Zealand writing for children and continues to do nationally and internationally. It's a privilege to be able to give public thanks to Storylines for its continued support of writing and reading for local children. The increasing prominence of the notable books lists, the innovation of the posters, this is crucial in an era when traditional publishing opportunities are curtailed and excellent books are being passed up by publishers. And I thank Chris Else for his unfailing wisdom with regard to my own writing and that of all the writers he works with. Modern children are increasingly sophisticated about life in general and about narrative. It might be hard for any of us to keep ahead of them, but I'll keep bashing away at the literary xylophone. I'm grateful to the readers who have enjoyed the results so far, and I thank today's audience and Storylines. Thank you.